Alternate history, or alternative history. I've always preferred the former. The latter just sounds wrong. Ever since people started studying history, they've always wondered how things could have gone differently. They might take a historical event and alter it a little, forming an entirely new timeline. Even though most timelines people create aren't exactly the most realistic, that hasn't stopped people from becoming fans of them due to the rule of cool. I myself have become a fan of several timelines over the years, but there is one timeline that sticks out to me. Dawn of Victory. Dawn of Victory is, or was, a timeline developed for a mod for the game Sins of a Solar Empire, which never got released. Yeah, that usually happens to mods like this. I mean, just look at most Hoi 4 mod projects. You might have seen in recent years that Dawn of Victory has gotten a reboot, and is currently being explored through live streams on the Templin channel. Oh yeah, the guys who made Dawn of Victory also went on to make the Templin Institute. Small world, I know. But we're not talking about that today. I'm here to talk about the old timeline. The one I remember stumbling upon around 2017 to 2018. I'm just saying this just in case people think I'm talking about things that aren't canon to the reboot. Alright, just bear with me here. But before I get into the timeline, I just want to talk about something. Since the reboot, the old wiki and website have been shut down, and as a result, I found myself having to use the Wayback Machine for research. It's always amazing how many websites they've archived, and thankfully, I have more than enough content to make a video. So yeah, let's go up into space and fight the fascists in the Vega system. The main point of Divergence is sometime in the mid-1930s, when a virus of alien origin makes landfall on Earth. This virus starts out as some moss-like infection that spreads across the Earth, infecting every living being it touches. The parasite then slowly drains the host of its life, eventually killing it altogether. While the virus spreads across the world in places like Africa, South America, and Australia, humanity is in the midst of some of its most tense years since the Great War. Despite this, the virus continued to spread rapidly in the South, deaths skyrocketing among the affected, leading to many affected nations evacuating their people to avoid the virus. Several nations, such as Britain and Canada, became hotspots for refugees fleeing what is then known as the African flu, while other nations, such as Germany and the Soviet Union, cared less. They have other things to worry about. But even the most apathetic nations couldn't ignore the virus for long, as eventually, places where the virus first made landfall are now experiencing the last steps of civilizational collapse. The virus had spread so much here that any attempt at evacuating whoever still stayed there was pointless. And as a result, they were all left to die, and such a trend is only continuing up north. Sounds pretty bad, right? Spoiler alert, it gets much worse. In May of 1943, in regions where the virus had total dominion over the land, several lights began showering across the night sky, eventually making landfall in those regions. What came out of the craters was arguably more horrifying than the virus itself. Massive alien machines began rising out of them, killing everything in sight. At this moment, the nations of the world ceased all existing conflicts in order to deal with the much greater alien threat, which soon got its official name, the Scinfaxi. Unfortunately, every attempt at resistance by humanity seemed futile, as such attempts were met by even greater losses on their end. Even the most powerful nations on Earth found it hard to hold the invaders back. 2 years after landfall, the Scinfaxi were at their peak, and many nations around the world have begun to lose hope. The Scinfaxi seemed to have won. That is, until one fateful October morning. An atomic bomb, codenamed Trinity by its creator, the United States, went on to wipe out nearly every bit of Scinfaxi around Chicago. As a result, the alien advance halted due to this sudden turn of events. Later, after 2 more atomic blasts in Tennessee, the United States would share its knowledge with other nations to help with the reconquest of Earth. Soon, All of Europe and all of North America north of Mexico were liberated. By this point, humanity seemed hopeful. They now have a weapon they can use against the Scinfaxi, and total liberation of the Earth seemed possible. Until it wasn't. Turns out the main reason why the Scinfaxi retreated from the north was due to cold weather. They're not exactly cold weather friends. However, in the more tropical regions down south, they are much stronger, and as a result, mankind found it nearly impossible to break through the Scinfaxi's total domination over the southern hemisphere, where now, massive obelisks have been erected emitting bursts of a seemingly unknown energy. Eventually, humanity just gave up, instead turning around half of the Earth into a quarantine zone. And although Earth would continue to see fighting between the Scinfaxi and man, most of the hostilities have more or less ceased. In the aftermath of the so-called Scinfaxi War, many human nations found themselves rebuilding what was lost after the war. Reports after the war found the death toll to be at least 600 million. As Eurasia fell into anarchy, some of the more stable nations such as Germany and the Soviet Union were able to take advantage of the chaos, absorbing many territories and shaping them in their own image. Meanwhile, other countries found themselves becoming one, like Britain and Canada, or splitting up, like Japan and the United States. While nations rebuild, many scientists have begun observing the regions controlled by the Scinfaxi, and have discovered that they seem to be altering the world's climate, and it is believed that their terraforming efforts would soon render the Earth inhospitable for human life. As a result, scientists predicted that humanity had only around 300 years before they went extinct. Uh-oh! What are they gonna do now? Well, they could just nuke the Scinfaxi like they did previously, but that would just prevent war from changing, so not that. Thankfully, through captured Scinfaxi technology, humanity was able to discover methods of space exploration once thought impossible given their situation. And as a result, the space race had begun. Soon, a German was launched into space, then another on the moon, then every other nation did the same thing. And as the decades progressed, space technology had been getting better, with the nations hoping it would advance fast enough to free humanity from the shadow of the Scinfaxi. As while they were building rockets and sending people into space, the effects of the Scinfaxi's presence became ever more noticeable. The temperature began to rise, the weather became more erratic, sea levels have been rising. But the Scinfaxi's terraforming isn't humanity's only problem. Due to them controlling only around half of their own planet, less resources were available for them to use. And given that most countries also have massive refugee populations on top of that, yeah, you'd bet there'd be trouble. It got so bad that many countries have started to introduce one-child policies in order to combat the demand for resources. But as the 20th century became the 21st, many countries fear that they wouldn't be able to save themselves in time before the Scinfaxi kills them all. Until one day, in the far-out futuristic year of 2024, the greatest discovery had been made. That year, American and British scientists figured out how to transport an object at speeds faster than light. Soon, they did it again. Then everyone else did it. And now, with this new technology, colonization of the solar system, no, the entire galaxy was now possible. But not everyone was happy, as soon many people would riot in the streets, leading to Hu Kwando having to oops, sorry, wrong timeline. And humanity's first target just so happened to be their closest. Alpha Centauri. The Alpha Centauri colonial venture, created as a joint project between several nations, had their first colonists depart on March 1st, 2041. Despite the risks of the long journey, it proved a massive success, and it paved the way for future colonization efforts. But as the technology improved and colonization became cheaper, many governments found it unnecessary to remain part of the project, and as a result, one by one, they began leaving the project for the sake of their old national ambitions. Over a century ago, they were fighting over control of their own planet. Now, They were fighting over thousands, but they weren't the only ones staking their claim in the vast reaches of the Orion Arm. The descendants of refugees that fled the Scinfaxi War found themselves now able to colonize many worlds. However, rather than continuing to hold the identities they had since before the war, they instead opted to form new identities based on whatever star systems they find themselves in. They never had a chance to form a national consciousness on Earth, and these efforts finally made it possible for them to do so. In the far reaches of the Orion Arm, humanity was entering a golden age, and to everyone involved, the future seemed bright. Uh-oh. On March 1st, 2050, the Scinfaxi resumed their long-delayed conquest of Earth, their giant machines sweeping through the north. But it can't be that bad, right? I mean, humanity literally went into space! Their technology is now centuries ahead from before! They can easily beat the Scinfaxi they lost. Although humanity's chances were much better than before, the advance of the Scinfaxi proved too great to resist. Soon, many countries began to evacuate the rest of their citizens to the colonies as their presence on Earth was swept away. Mankind's last 30 hours on Earth saw 10,000 German soldiers fighting to save Berlin in arguably their most heroic act. But after those 30 hours, the last soldier defending Berlin was killed. And not even seconds after this happened, humanity dealt one final blow to the Scinfaxi. Thousands of nuclear warheads were fired all over the planet, killing most of the Scinfaxi presence, with the nuclear winter killing off the rest. The entire solar system was turned into a quarantine zone, with no nations allowed to traverse the system in any capacity. Thankfully, every human nation on Earth had relocated to their colonies prior to the war. Yet despite this, they left the cradle of humanity inhospitable, possibly forever. Ever since the Scinfaxi were destroyed, old rivalries between the human nations started to reappear. And no rivalry is more notable than the one between the Greater German Reich and the Soviet Union. These two nations would end up creating some of the most violent conflicts the Orion Arm had ever faced. However, none are as notable as the conflict that would happen in the Vega system. No, not that Vega. Seriously? Once a German colony created to dump those who refused to adhere to German society and ideology, said colony would soon erupt into civil war, eventually culminating in the destruction of the fascist Union state that controlled the system. The new Vega Confederation, supported by the Soviet Union, would soon align itself with them both diplomatically and ideologically. Fast forward to 2285, when the German Reich gave a list of demands for the Soviet Union and their allies, and when they failed to meet their demands, the Soviet-German War began. This war would become the largest in mankind's history, as massive fleets of warships began firing down on each other on several systems across the Orion Arm. Unfortunately, the timeline stops at 2289, meaning we don't even get to see the end of the war. Bummer, isn't it? But yeah! That's Dawn of Victory! I clearly glossed over a lot in this timeline, but I think I got the major points down. Although, there's still one more thing I wanted to talk about. Okay, so originally I had this bit where I realized that humanity kind of sucks in this timeline because they managed to destroy their planet and still fight afterwards, even though they are digging themselves into a bigger hole, yada yada. But then I watched Templin's first Dawn of Victory video, and I quickly realized that what I originally planned was pointless. Yeah, I know I said earlier that I wasn't talking about the reboot, but the conclusions I came to with the original timeline were pretty much identical to what Templin was going for in the reboot anyway. So if you want an overview of what this timeline is trying to achieve, I've linked to Templin's Dawn of Victory playlist, as well as the Dawn of Victory channel in the description. Please go check them out. Yeah, I think I'm just gonna go away for a few months again. I think that's what I need. Also, who the fuck is Rasfati?